And I just think about how many men are out there who are like shitty, toxic dudes. And I just mourn the people they could have been if we didn't have the system that confined them and forced them to do that and rewarded them and punished them if they didn't conform. Gives them so much power and reward for being exactly this terrible thing that they're purported to be. But it's like a social habit, and it's not. I can't believe that because you have a penis, you're like an inherently like sexually evil creature that needs to be like stopped.
This is Only the Bold, where I have deep, riveting, and fascinating conversations with truly phenomenal humans. I'm your gay, ADHD-having, and compulsively curious host, Gia Goodrich, and among many things, I can't get enough of hearing people's incredible stories and getting inside the way their brains work. Each week, I have conversations where we dig below the surface and really uncover everything it takes to live a truly bold life. Despite the messages we get from media and popular culture, the boldest, truest version of yourself is exactly what the world needs. Hello, hi, hey. I am so glad to be back. We've been a little wishy-washy in terms of timing, but we are back on track to keep things consistent as best as I can. But yes, seriously, we have some amazing episodes coming out, including this one with such a wonderful, bold soul. And what's so fabulous about this conversation is we got the chance to really dig into so much. To dig into the in-between spaces and nuance and empathy, also to talk about shows and how they depict gender and representation. And one of the things that's so great about Pride Month is that a lot of these conversations end up showing up in the zeitgeist of the world because we have all the rainbows and all of this coming along. But what's interesting is we filmed this back in March because we've been up in this conversation for a long time now because, you know, obviously live, sleep, and breathe it. But I am so excited to share this with you because this is one of the most fun conversations, one of the most deep, like just the way that they can zoom in and zoom out and bring things totally to the theoretical and then down to practical experience is just so fabulous. And I love their gorgeous, blonde, curly locked brain. And I think you're just going to absolutely love them too. So just as a quick update before we roll into the episode, I am doing really well. Thanks for asking. I am still in the midst of this whirlwind situation when it comes to my course, Magnetic in Video. And it's been really interesting because I've enrolled students. It's great, but we're also in this transition from the last cohort that was doing live sessions to this pre-recorded content. And of course, I have the perfection monster that's always on my shoulder, and I do my best to tame it and, you know, have it sit in the background. But it's been this journey of really making sure that I can stick to a schedule, getting this content out in the best way possible without succumbing to the perfectionism or being paralyzed by the overwhelm of all of it. And thankfully, I have these incredible students who are in there who are already getting results and we're able to connect. And it's just been really fabulous so far. But it's just really been pulling on this thread for me of the balancing of the metaphysical and the physical. So having this part of me that is really trying to lean away from the hustle and the masculine energy and just all of this adrenaline, cortisol, power through stuff that I've basically been in my whole life, be better, faster, stronger, and leaning more into the fluidity and the space and the presence with meditation and all of these practices. But I still am very much a human living in the 3D. And so it's been really interesting navigating all of that and being somebody who's responsible, who's building a company, who is luckily entrusted to serve and to teach these amazing people who are generous enough and kind enough and just incredibly fabulous enough to be in this process, to be able to show up magnetically in video. So if you want more info about that, I have a masterclass link below in the description to check out, hang out with me. It's totally for free and just for you. But also, I just have to be real that it's a journey. And it's funny because when people talk about, oh, I've had these spiritual ascensions and I'm a new person, I'm just like, that sounds great for you. But for me, it's been a little more of a rocky road where I'll have these moments of like these epiphanies where I'm like, oh my gosh, wow, I'm a totally different person. This is amazing. And then I'll catch myself sliding back into like binge eating something that I don't really want to eat and just seeing all these old habits. So it's very much this in-between space, navigating that, which is so much the meditation of my life and also part of this conversation that you're going to listen to in a second. And so I just appreciate you, that you're here, that you're on this journey, that we're on this journey together, and I fucking love you. And with that, let's roll into the episode. Today's guest is an educator, consultant, artist, scholar, and D&D master. They are a beautiful being with a master's in gender and cultural studies from Simmons University and use this expertise to share insightful commentary and guidance on everything related to gender, sexuality, and identity. As one of my favorite humans that I have yet to meet in real life, which I am very sorry about, but I hope to remedy soon, they constantly delight and inspire me with their magnetic, queertastic energy. And the content they create on Instagram and TikTok harkens back to their history in theater, makeup, and fine art as a multidisciplinary genius they are, which makes them a joy to watch and learn from. What's more, she helps both individuals and institutions through gender consultation services and inclusivity consulting in a way which amplifies cultural competency and affirming practices for the LGBTQIA+ community. The glorious, the rigorous, and the fantabulously bold soul, Matisse DuPont. Today's guest is an educator, consultant, artist, scholar, and D&D master. They are a beautiful being with a master's in gender and cultural studies from Simmons University and use this expertise to share insightful commentary and guidance on everything related to gender, sexuality, and identity. As one of my favorite humans that I have yet to meet in real life, which I am very sorry about, but I hope to remedy soon, they constantly delight and inspire me with their magnetic, queertastic energy. And the content they create on Instagram and TikTok harkens back to their history in theater, makeup, and fine art as a multidisciplinary genius they are, which makes them a joy to watch and learn from. What's more, she helps both individuals and institutions through gender consultation services and inclusivity consulting in a way which amplifies cultural competency and affirming practices for the LGBTQIA+ community. The glorious, the rigorous, and the fantabulously bold soul, Matisse DuPont. Well, so I'm so excited to have you here. When we were talking, I was like, I feel like I know you.
I totally agree.
And it's one of these things that, like, especially now, teaching people to show up magnetically in video, I just so deeply appreciate it when I see content creators and there's just so much alignment between the videos that you watch and then when you meet them or interact with them, like the way their humanity actually is. I guess to start, like, I would just be curious about your intro into video and if it was like how it was getting into that place where you're like feeling pretty aligned or maybe I don't even know, maybe you don't feel aligned every day. What's that experience for you?
I mean, I always was a performer. I was always on stage. I used to do drag for a little while, and so I'm definitely like I felt like it wasn't the like being on camera or being seen that was the part that was tripping me up. At first it was my perfectionism. I think when I started out, it was very much like I need to have everything perfect. All the words need to be exactly crisp and correct. And as I've gone along, I've allowed myself to let that go to a certain extent where it doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be me speaking to the world. But also being able to get to the point where I'm not constantly resetting or saying it over and over again. And I still do many takes. It's not like I don't do takes. I absolutely do takes. It just takes a little while to get rid of the nerves of flubbing and going blah, 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 blah. Oh,
Yeah.
I need to say that again, you know?
Oh my gosh, I know so much. And it's so funny because every once in a while I'll post a video or something where I show the takes and I show me restart. And I forget for people who aren't in it that it is like a mind blowing thing to know that we all do that because there is just this default assumption and that it's like, born this way, hashtag woke up like this. And it's like, no, 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 honey, no. This has taken
This is
me
practice.
25 takes. Yes, after 10 years of doing it. But I love that you're talking about perfectionism already off the bat because I feel like doing what you're doing and talking about queer theory and gender theory and all of this stuff that can be so weighty, so transformational, so easy to fuck up. It seems like your connection to perfectionism must be pretty solid if it was already something that you had coming into it. And I'm curious how you found yourself really unwinding that so you could show up without letting some of that stuff stop you. Because I think for a lot of people, the perfectionism stops them from ever starting and definitely from continuing.
I think it's actually a tighter mask of self that is more closer to myself. Like it's a really meticulously painted mask that is very actually like close to me. And so it's not like the perfectionism is unwound, it's just more polished and I care a little bit less about it because it's already polished. Or it's something that needs to be resharpened on occasion, but it's not that there's more perfectionism, it's just that I feel like I did it enough and now there are certain things that I can do by habit that my perfectionist side is satisfied with versus completely being like letting go entirely, which I wish I could do. That sounds freeing.
Phenomenal.
But
Yeah.
but instead it's sort of more confidence in that I can trust my habits are as close to whatever I want them to be or are easy to hone in on again if I take a moment. Um, so I think that's maybe more of what's actually happened versus like an unwinding. It's more of like I think maybe like developing confidence. Honestly, I've always been a confident person, but like developing confidence on camera and on screen and knowing that my voice is useful. And if I say like too many times, no one cares. Or if I'm saying, it's part of the charm and it's okay.
Okay, so this is really fascinating to me because I think that I refer to myself as a reformed perfectionist, which to me I liken to like religion, like people who like show up with religious trauma, right? Where it's like that doesn't mean that I'm ever going to be like completely totally healed. It's going to be a part of my story and my life path and my trauma and also lots of great stuff that was, that I learned and gleaned from that as well. For me, it's like about how much I let it run the show and training myself out of that and not knowing that I'm not going to be perfect 100% of the time. But what's interesting in what you said that I reflect on, but sort of in a different way, is the standards when it comes to
Hmm.
perfectionism.
Yes.
And for me, the separation that really gave me confidence ultimately was knowing that my standards were always so much higher. We're talking about 2, 3x higher than anyone else's, including my clients or audience or anything like that. And so once I really realized that, I understood that, okay, I can be successful if I'm meeting their expectations, because even if I'm not meeting my own, in fact, it's almost impossible to meet my own, but more often than not, I can meet theirs. And like, that's what success looks like. But I'm fascinated with you about the idea of the habits and training yourself unconsciously to get, yeah. So can you say more about that? Because that's super fascinating to me.
Absolutely. Habits are one of my favorite, like things that I don't talk about is habits online, but it's one of my favorite sort of areas of philosophy. There was this book I read in grad school called Living Across and Through Skins. And it was this feminist gender scholar who took this like old dead white guy's theory of habits. John Dewey, he's the school of philosophy called American pragmatism. And it's old dead white guy educational thing from like the 1800s at some point. So a lot of, eat the meat, spit out the bones. There's a lot of bones. But one thing that this philosopher Shannon Sullivan was able to do was pull out this notion of habits and how we are organisms who live in environments and we are surviving these environments. There are physical, material environments, there are social environments, and we learn habits. Our habits are imbued into our body, the sort of leaving behind a body mind duality and embracing that to be a body is an active, continual thing over and over, and that we are able to put things into ourselves. There are also many things that our environments have trained us and put habits that like can be ingrained really deeply, or also habits are always changeable with effort sometimes. Specifically, I'm obsessed with the way that Shannon Sullivan has reformed Judith Butler's gender performativity as habits. It's like it was one of those like light
Ooh.
bulb moments. It was like, oh my goodness, that's such an interesting way to look at this like classic theory. But I'm obsessed with agency as a concept and as something I strive for and strive my best to give other people the permission to do, even though it's also part of the perfectionism is trying to control other people's agency, which is not something I want to be doing, and this sort of controlling this. So I think it's been able to, allow myself to have agency over the habits I form, feeling less pressure to concede to the habits of society while also recognizing where I can and can't change things. And that's one of my frameworks that I really live in.
It sounds like a dance between ownership and surrender. For myself, very recently, what has come up a lot is dismantling, like you mentioned, this Cartesian, which, if you're not familiar, Descartes was one of these white cis hetero dude bros that was like, the mind and body are separate from each other and we should never talk about them and the same thing. That like deeply fucked us up for centuries. There was a lot of value that came out from that and other people, but also there's just a lot that we're having to unwind. For me, that reconciliation of things that have been presented as dualities and really understanding that they aren't. You can have full ownership of how you're showing up and what your habits are and how you express yourself, whilst also surrendering to the way that it's received, trying to control and manipulate your environment and way people interact. Yeah, and that's so fascinating to me that you've linked that to habits through everything, because I have not ever thought about it from that perspective.
Yeah, and it's not the like, I know there's like the 7 habits for highly effective. I've never read that. I don't know what it is. I don't know what they say. I don't know if it's anything like what I'm saying. But yeah, because it's the habits in this book. It's all about like the things your body knows how to do without you having to think much about it. But the problem is sometimes the things that you're not thinking about aren't things that you want to be or do.
So, what are some of the habits that have been transformative for you that you've been able to build or reshape or remodel?
Being a trans person, probably like a ton. Like
Uh,
as far as personally, when it comes to like my experience of gender, because so much of gender is done through the repetition of habits, and that's like how people come into their gender in a lot of ways. And taking agency and actually like being, no, I'm not going to do the habits that I was supposed to do, that you thought that society has framed come forth from the body, but instead society is probably put into the body. And I'm like, I don't want those in my body. Get them out of here. Let me put new things in there. So that's one big one. I think when it comes more to like online and like, creating content and making videos and being confident on camera, it's really about taking deep breaths before I start talking so I don't have to cut as much out. I think that's like one of those really, really specific habits where you kind of like take that deep breath, hit go, and then you start speaking so you don't have to cut out that inhale. That's a really, really micro habit that has been game changing as far as like time and editing for myself. Remembering that, actually I find like looking at myself on the screen reads as making eye contact with like the audience when I'm making like a video on my phone, like these little things. But also habits are huge. Like society has habits. So it's many levels.
I love talking to people like yourself that are like so steeped in the theoretical and also the practical application, because you just get this sense that you can zoom in and out in anything we talk about so easily, right? It's like, well, yeah, we can talk about the specific thing that you're talking about, but also look at the context and the mind-boggling like framework that exists with it, which my brain has always operated that way. And so it just makes me so happy. They wouldn't have heard this, but the way that we started is you guided us through 3 breaths.
Yes.
That is something like I tell every guest when I read their intro right before, I'm like, I always get nervous for reading the intro. And I think as a neurodivergent kid, there was always a lot of difficulty when it came to reading out loud. So everything is condensed. It also activates the part of me that like wants to do a good job, wants to be liked, wants to impress. And so all of that is always sparked as soon as I start to do that. And what's funny is I read it and I can feel my breath. I can usually hide it pretty well because I've been doing this for long enough, but I haven't ever said, okay, I'm going to take a breath before I get going to really calm and anchor myself, which is something I always recommend to other people and just like literally have not done myself. So yeah, that like tactic, trick, hack, I think is super powerful, especially when we're talking about authenticity and how we show up. Because any of those feelings, like I was talking about, that are activated are all coming from the parasympathetic fight flight response. And so if I'm coming from that place of ultimately in my nervous system, I don't feel safe, I know I'm not going to be activating the most authenticity.
I really struggle with the moments of stress and how when I'm not the me I want to be. I talk about that in therapy all the time. These moments where feel like I'm not myself because it's just this moment of stress and like no one else can tell you're stressed. It's just this your body is like tense. As far as making content goes, one thing that used to stress me out so much was feeling like I had to memorize a script. It brought me back to like high school theater days where I just have a hard time. I have ADHD and I feel like one component is sometimes my working memory is pretty good, but when I have to like have something memorized, it doesn't work for me. So early on, I liked doing like Instagram live interviews. That was sort of my actual introduction to video. That first 15 seconds that's going to be saved on the front of the timeline, like that's shared in the stories. I would try my best to like memorize this perfect 15 seconds so that when it was playing and shared in the stories, it was everything you needed. And that stressed me out so much. It would like ruin it. And then I would spend the next 5 minutes recovering and like trying to like introduce a guest, like not a good
Right.
time, and so letting myself just speak, and it's okay if I say something wrong, it helps me calm my nerves. I think there's a lot of things that I've learned to do that are more like telling myself something so I can calm my nerves so I'm not as affected. An example is like incorporating she as one of my pronouns. I was always like they, them, they, them, they, them. And I started teaching publicly. And so often at the very beginning of the intro, someone who I'm about to educate about how to use pronouns or how to reconfigure the way that you're seeing gender, this person introducing me, bringing me in very lovingly would just be like, oh, and she is, and it would like ruin my day. And I was about to teach. And I sort of told myself, no, it's okay. You should probably just accept that so that you're not as upset later. Are there any things that you ever do that you know that you're upset by that you've been able to find the trigger and let go of it or reframe it for yourself? Has that ever been something you've been able to do?
Totally, yes. But I'm curious for you really fast before I answer that. Like that question that you asked yourself, like when you did that, did it offer an emotional release?
Absolutely. It was game changing. It was the difference between me feeling like I'm being misgendered and me being like, no, people see me that way and it's not bad. Women are amazing and I am very feminine. Like I'm a high femme person. Why am I upset if someone's taking their frameworks that they are currently operating in that I'm about to help them understand differently, perhaps? Why am I going to fault them and make myself upset because they see me as in their binary frameworks as feminine and like a woman? I'm like, there's nothing bad about that. It's wrong compared to like my most perfectionist version of my description of self and gender. But my standards like are 3 times higher and everyone else, just to ping it back.
Right. That's why we connect so much.
No, for real though. When you were saying that, I was just like, wow, me too. Like the biggest same.
Yes. And one of the things, and I want to get back to your question, but one of the things that was an insight that I gleaned, and I talk about it in terms of like a level up where it's like, oh my gosh, I just grew 3 sizes from this one little mushroom. That's fucking amazing. Was that realizing that disparity, but then also realizing that my relationship to my work, my feelings about my work are inherently capricious. They change wildly depending on the part of the process that I'm in. I found a meme at one point and it was like all these different pictures of celebrities with all of these different emotions from like fear to excitement to like disaster, like all of this stuff. And it was like me preparing for a shoot, me on the day, me. And I was just like, oh, nothing sees me more than this because I could have same image, same everything. But at one point I could think it's horrible. I'm a fraud. It's the worst ever. And separated by a little bit of time, I might also be thinking like later, like, oh my gosh, that was really good. I'm like low-key IKEA genius. Why didn't anybody tell me? And it's like the exact same stimuli. So those having, when it finally clicked, those two things, I really felt like, oh, okay, I can really now be more process oriented, which everybody else has always said is the key to success and joy. You know, it's the journey, not the destination. Like all these platitudes that never really resonated for me. Once I got those keys, I was like, oh, okay, now it makes sense. Now I can really make it about that. But to jump back to what you were saying, the reason I had a little bit of a squidgy face when you were talking about asking yourself that question, like, could this be okay? I think there's so much nuance in the questions we ask ourselves, and it takes a lot of emotional insight and like feeling into the answer to be able to really understand like energetically what's going on behind it. What I thought when you said that is that for me, because I've dealt with for so long this emotional programming of I need to emotionally hostess, I need to take care, I need to people please, that if I had been asking myself that question, it would have been like an emotional bypass, like, oh, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, because I just want to feel better about this. It's fine. Instead of what probably would have been the emotional release for me would have been to address it in a kind way, because that's the thing that feels scarier to me. But that ultimately would have been, I think, more in line with my authenticity. And so it's interesting that for all of us, because of the way we walk through the world, our programming, all of this stuff, we have these different answers to these different questions, and finding the question that's going to unlock that piece that's going to make you feel relieved about whatever's happening is so amazing. It's fascinating to me that it's always so different for everyone because of what we're rocking with.
I truly think everyone is in our own context. I think we share like a particular material reality. It's not the like, I think therefore I am, no one else exists, we're in the Matrix vibes, but we really all have such incredibly unique experiences that also resonate along large scale patterns, but patterns also like don't map onto the individual experience exactly. So I really, really come back to this point of like, really every single platitude gets at some sort of large scale human experience, but it might not be part of yours, and that's okay. And everyone has such a specific individualized relationship to these social structures all around us. I think in studying history, one thing that was really interesting was understanding that when we're like writing a history, we're trying to get at like the general like zeitgeist of a moment. And it's never going to actually account for the individual experiences of all the people who lived at that particular time and place. And remembering that the exact same thing is happening right now and right now and right now. There are like billions of contexts right now. There are patterns amongst them, but every single one of us are moving through time and space, and all of our contexts are constantly shifting, and our environments impact us. They shape us. We shape them back, but it's not a one-way street. But it's easy to just be like, yeah, everyone's different, whatever. But like really, you and like your neighbor, even though you grew up in the same like class, you might be the same race and gender, and your family might look the same. It's different. And it's really hard to conceptualize that. In fact, it's like too big of a thing for your brain to conceptualize at all times. It's easier to look at patterns.
I'm just thinking with siblings. I have 4 sisters, but the one that was raised closest to me, we have the most similar upbringing. Our response to that upbringing, how it felt for both of us, was so wildly different. My mom talks about it a lot, where she really did her best, as every parent does, but her personality, her stories, her emotional toolkit was really suited to me. My sister, not so much. And so whilst I felt really supported at home, really seen, really validated, had more issues in school and other places, she had issues in school and other places feeling like she belonged. And also, a lot of times in our household, because as much as my mom would try and work at it and everything, there was just a fundamental difference in understanding that was a large enough chasm that my sister didn't feel supported all the times in the way that everybody would have loved for her to feel that way. And to me, like with the show, the whole crux of it being this idea of boldness is that when I think of the most bold and embodied way that I can show up in a particular situation, what that looks like could be exactly opposite for the person next to me. That has taken a long time for me to really wrap my brain around, because like, obviously everybody's like me. And when you're confronted with that truth, that it's like, oh my gosh, actually that's not the case. Whoa, I have been running around like a bull in a china shop, treating everyone like they have the same emotional capacity, they have the same language, they have the same hurts and all of this stuff as I do, then once that like was revealed to me, and it was like I think a slow revelation, it was just like, wow, I really had been, out of no fault of my own, but I had been missing so much about human connection because I had been seeing the landscape like through my own map exclusively. One of our former guests, who's incredible, said, quoted somebody else, I think, that the map is not the territory, and that the map is an abstract way to describe a physical location. And inherently, that abstraction is going to mean that it's not one in one. And we all have our own maps of the way that we see things. It's exciting, but also it's like scary and confusing when you're like, you and everyone else are such vastly different humans, and I can't really wrap my mind around it. And yet we're in this dance together.
Gender is my sort of lens that I use a lot. So I'm going to jump there but this, you were talking about this connectivity, and I always think about gender. It is the map of an embodied experience. It's this abstracted thing, and it's not perfectly representational of all our lived embodied experiences according to like our sex assignment. But I also think about gender as this, it exists in the interconnectedness. I think we tend to internalize like, what is my unique gender? What are other people's that have the exact same relationship as I do? And it's like, well, no one's going to have the same relationship to these structures. And it's good to find community. It's really helpful. But I think people get stuck in trying to find their true self that is going to relate to other people's true selves that are the same true self, because none of us are going to have the same experience. So what you were saying about what feels bold to you and what other people's experiences of boldness might be. I remember really early on in my transition, and something I talked to a lot of folks about, is those moments that feel huge and terrifying. No one else is going to notice. Or maybe they do, but maybe they don't say anything. I remember like putting blush on for the first time, walking out the door with like a little blush. And I was like, everyone's going to see and stare. And no one noticed. Like no one batted an eye. No one cared. And I was like, oh, okay, that felt huge to me. Okay, let's do the next one. What else is scary to me? Let's try that too, you know?
Mm.
And so that's sort of, I think, what was resonating with me is what feels bold to you isn't the same as other people's. And you can look at that from so many different angles. And that was my angle.
And that makes me think about the concepts of like gender euphoria. There are circumstances that, or I mean, I guess this also like ties to, when somebody's misgendering somebody else, right? That like in their mind, if like, let's assuming they're a conscientious human, they're trying to maybe be as affirming as possible, but they don't know what is going to feel good to you. And ideally, we would want to get to a place where we're making less assumptions. So we, have a conversation without assuming things like what somebody's pronouns are that would be affirming or things like that. There's a creator that I follow that I just love who was talking about what like had on this dress and was saying like, this dress is the embodiment of my gender euphoria, like the way it moves, and all of this stuff. We just know that for other people, that same exact dress would maybe inspire the exact opposite sentiment. So can you talk someone about, anything that comes up for you, but like our inner experiences and how they diverge, but then it's all about the spaces that connect us, because if you're alone on an island and you're literally the only human, gender probably isn't going to be such a thing on your mind.
It probably won't be. I mean, it might be, because you weren't born and raised on the island alone. You still will carry around all the gender that was instilled in you up until that desert island. But yeah, probably will slip away. I mean, that's kind of what happened with the pandemic. The eyes of society and the consequences for not performing your gender perfectly, those disappeared to a big extent. So people took agency and did some stuff with it, which was really exciting. So this dance between the internal sense of self and living in a world where there are like social environments and like with these gender habits in them, it really is a dance, because my frameworks for how I understand relationships in general to bodies and these social cues and acts and assumptions and aesthetics and all of these things, it's really easy to try to look for universals when really that's my relationship to them. And trying to understand that every other person is going to come in with their own frameworks, then I have no clue what their framework or frame of reference is.
Yeah.
You can kind of guess, once again, patterns. Like, I know a lot of times when I'm talking to like a cisgender person who doesn't know a lot of trans people or hasn't taken a moment to delve into like what is gender, and it's just like, which is like fine, a lot, that's just like where people are. But I know that when they're doing that, I've noticed a pattern where in trying to guess what their frameworks might be, I still don't know for sure, but I see them looking for bodies. They are not looking at people and their personhood or their aesthetic or their sense of self. They're looking to examine and categorize bodies. Like, that's their primary focus. And it's interesting because you can see people looking at each other differently, and you're trying to parse out, like, why am I being looked at by whom? Who are they? What do I think that they are in my own concepts? How do I think that they see themselves in their own concepts? And there's so much guesswork, and we'll never know. But on the other hand, when we're trying to find our own sense of self, we're reliant upon our frameworks, which oftentimes aren't even a framework we even want. I think early on, when a lot of trans people are first, or even just queer people in general, talking about sexuality and gender as two parts of a similar project, there is, I don't know if I want to use the word unlearning, but there is a recognition that the frameworks that you've been taught aren't working anymore, and looking to find new frameworks that help you understand yourself. But also, we're still at the beck and whim of what's socially contextually available around you. I think about my urges and things that I had toward like not really responding well to masculinity or manhood or the things that were expected of me given the body that I have, and trying to figure out, how do I reckon with that? My earlier sense of self came from seeing, well, there are feminine, quote, very big quotes on feminine, but like, because like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
But like, gay men was really like the first thing I was like, oh, that's my, but that's because it was 2006 and that was in the zeitgeist of what I could see in a small town in New Hampshire. That was the only option. I didn't know what a trans person was.
Right.
So it was close enough. And then once I learned more frameworks, I was like, oh, I can reconfigure myself. And so it's really this back and forth between yourself, frameworks that other people are using, mysterious frameworks that you don't know about, other people's internal dialogues that you don't have access to. And even if you did have access to them, maybe people don't know how to express themselves, because a lot of these frameworks are nonverbal, which is also really tricky. A lot of gender is nonverbal. People think that we can have a conversation about it, and really it's people making quick assumptions based on visuals, and that's really frustrating. Feeling like you're doing all this work to convey something and people don't see it, or they're actively choosing not to see it even though they see.
What I would add is that the same suite of words have very different associations depending on who you're talking to. There are constantly new words and phrases being added to the mix that we become aware of at different times. And so there's always this continual learning that happens that for some people can feel very destabilizing, and for other people can feel very exciting, or a mix of both. I think I've certainly felt a mix of both at times. There's something that you said that I want your thoughts on, because I might have this totally ass backwards, so feel free to let me know. But one of the things that I've noticed with myself and with a lot of people in the queer community is this tendency to, in the beginning, I would say, like, overshoot the mark. When you're coming into a space and you're wanting to connect because you still have like your same map or you're rapidly learning a new one, usually what I've noticed is people tend to overcorrect and lock on to a version of their identity that they almost need to perform for that period of time. And then after a little bit of time, they sink into something that feels a bit more authentic. To use myself as a really suboptimal example, when I came out as a lesbian, I had a very deeply unfortunate fashion 3 years because I wanted to flag that I was gay because nobody knew. And so I would wear my shirts on backwards so you could see that I had boobs, but they were baggy. And then I would wear cargo pants, and just like I wanted to have the gay aesthetic emanating so I could be identified as a part of this group. Now, that's not to say I don't love certain quote unquote like masculine shapes or cuts or things like that in my wardrobe, but it's more about the energy behind it, what's driving the decisions that I was making. And it was very much about being seen and identified in a particular way. Whereas now I can give two shits because my queerness emanates. And if you can't vibe it, that's fine, but that's on you, babe. And you'll probably pick up on it within a few seconds of us interacting.
Oh, yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on that? And what have you noticed?
How are you in my brain, Gia? I run a service, a little gender consult service where people can come in and basically it's sort of like office hours tutoring with some coaching thrown in, kind of that kind of vibe, specifically to talk about like gender theory, the history of the queer community, all that kind of good stuff. One thing when people who are like, I'm just starting, what do I do? How do I get people to see me as I want to be seen? I'm always like, well, have you done theater? And they're like, of course, there are all these queer people, and they're like, yes, I've done theater. um, the director always says there's like a classic thing where they say, overshoot it so that we can pull you back. If you never get to that mark, we can't do anything with it. We've got to do it bigger and then pull back to the line where we actually want it. That's
Yeah.
like the way that you do theater to get this like a particular, very like on stage emotion across. You go so big and then you pull it back. And so I actually think that this is a thing that people do, as you're saying, because you want to be seen. I also think it's something that can be deployed with agency on purpose as part of a communication strategy across time.
Ooh.
Knowing that like a transition either into whatever identity that you are moving toward, your trajectory, it will be something that happens over time. So why not treat it as something that exists across time? The things that one might need to do to be seen, given the current circumstances, sometimes you need to break something to get across. And so I can use myself also as a suboptimal example. I love that phrase. That's amazing. Okay. Um, Early in my transition when I was like, I'm not basically like my first part was like, I'm whatever non-binary umbrella, sure. But like my first thing was like, I'm an agender. That was like my thing of breaking it for myself was like, well, I just need to remove something so I can figure out what's going to go there. I think that there's still this hole that is like a part of the system that we can't get rid of. So I'm going to take out what was there. I know I'm going to have to fill it with something later. We'll get to that. And then like a couple years later, it was like, well, I people are not reading that I'm not a man, even though I'm doing things that for me feel really huge and bold.
Hmm.
What do I need to do to like get that memo across? And so for basically like there was a 2-year period where I was growing my hair out really long and I have very curly hair that's like very tedious to take care of.
Deeply resonate.
Um, it's beautiful. It's like golden ringlets. I love it. And also, I'm like, I don't have the time. Plus, I was doing that. I was doing a full face of makeup. I was wearing heels all time. And it was just like this massive performance, but it did the job. Earlier, I mentioned gender performativity really, really quickly. It's not just a performance like a show, it's the doing over and over and over and over and over and over again across time. That's like, and your sense of self comes from this doing over and over and over and over and over. Also, this is where habits come in again. But like I needed to have a time period, not just like I'm coming out. It needed to be a thing with longevity to get the point across. Even if it meant people realizing, oh, like my students, I taught at international like language schools teaching English for like years. My students were not getting they them, but at least they weren't seeing me as a man anymore.
Mm.
And that was what I needed for that moment. I needed to break out and go somewhere else. And it sounds sort of like what you were talking about with your like your lesbian aesthetic. You needed to make sure people like did not see you as straight anymore. And
Yes.
sometimes that's the first phase. People do that, but they don't realize that they can do that on purpose.
My mind is being blown as you say this. Using it as a technique that you're actively leveraging is just like, wow. Because to me, the way I've always thought about it, again, going back to like perfectionism, is that I should have magically had the same sense of confidence and self and belonging that I have now from the jump. And in hindsight, it's embarrassing to look back and see how hard I was trying. But that very much sits in this perfectionism thing, right? Like not allowing for there to be a journey to get to where you are. And I think that that is so affirming and something when I talk to people about creativity or building a skill or a discipline that's, like Bill Withers, who's an incredible jazz musician that we lost way too soon, said, you can't get to wonderful without passing through all right. When I heard that quote for the first time, I was just like, fuck, yes. Like it just feels like such a weight that's off my shoulders that it's like, yeah, it's okay to suck for a while. It's okay to not have it all figured out. And yet, what's interesting is like when you think about integrating knowledge, that I can have this knowledge over here, but I can also have not been applying it over here. And hearing you say that, it's like, oh my gosh, like it's this full circle moment of taking this thing and bringing it to my own lived experience in a really meaningful way.
My whole thing is like, I never want to be an authority. I always want to just prompt and spark creativity and curiosity. That's the best reaction you could have had, is just like a moment of like, oh, that's like
Yeah.
all I ever want. I'm like so giddy. Thank you for letting me witness that thought process. That's like my biggest joy as an educator, is exactly what you just did. That made me so happy to hear. And I don't know, I'm just like getting all verklempt, but like, it's gorgeous.
Yay, the light bulb moments. Well, okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. The not wanting to be an expert, and yet your platforms, you are almost always speaking to people who want to learn more, want to do more, but don't really have the knowledge yet. So by association to them, you are an expert. What does that relationship feel like to you?
I mean, it's a lot of pressure. And I think this comes back to sort of the perfectionism earlier, is feeling that pressure immediately. When I was first starting to make content that was clearly educational, I started every video because on TikTok, you need like that tagline. I was like, hi, my name is Matisse. I use they, or she pronouns. I've got a master's degree in gender and cultural studies. And today we're talking about blank. I was like very route. I always appealed to this credential that I have because it
Mhm.
made sure people were listening to me. I've dropped that for the most part now. Occasionally I'll drop it when I'm like being like, I'm talking about something really difficult. Please know that I can be a guide for this like difficult topic. It is interesting being framed as an expert. Adrienne Maree Brown has a book called We Will Not Cancel Us that is such a phenomenal book. I just like love it so much. But there's one quote in there that I'm going to butcher the quote. I don't have it in front of me, but it still rings. This idea rings in my head, is this idea of when you are framed and people see you as an educator or an expert in any way, shape, or form, what you lose, and a very sad thing that you lose, is the ability to brainstorm or to think on your feet or not know and be curious, because everything that you say is construed as if you are an authority and it's a fact. Even though if you're explicitly being like, I'm not sure about this yet, here's something I'm currently thinking about,
Yeah.
you lose the ability to do that. I'm very conscious of that. And I kind of mourn my early on days of social media where I could just say or do anything that was like crossing my brain. And I still sort of do that on occasion. I let myself go there. But I'm
Mhm.
always in the back of my mind being like, well, I know people perceive me as someone who knows better, which once again, I don't really want that. Or people also think that I can like tell them what they are. And I'm very clear, I don't want the power to validate or invalidate anything about you. And the fact that you want to give me that power is scary to me
Mhm.
in many levels.
Yeah, because you're trusting your sense of belonging and knowing about your relationship to yourself in another human being who has their own relationship to everything.
And these are strangers on the internet. These are people in my comment sections being like, wow, this is so validating. Now I know who I really am. And I'm like, I love that you were able to get there. And also, I know you're putting it on me as this person who gave you this revelation. And I'm glad I gave you a revelation, but I can't be the diagnostician of this. It doesn't work like that. Identity is not something that one diagnoses in this particular way. I think it gets conflated because there are diagnostic models specifically with trans folks, and the fact that we need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to get access to medical care, which is a whole can of worms, right?
Mhm.
So, but people think that like I have because I've studied gender formally, I've got some sort of ability to diagnose or evaluate. The way I create content is very mindful of that. And I try my very best to put in like a caveat. I hate that when I have to like say like, hey, I'm going to say something. And just so you know, here's all the 10 caveats that I know you're going to come at me for in the comments. And it takes like 15 seconds of my precious 60 seconds,
Right.
like pre-thinking about all the things people could or might say. And you're like, no, I know I've accounted for them, but also the internet's a context removal machine. So you don't know that I already know those things. And people want to correct an expert also. That's the other side.
Right.
People love to come in and tell someone that they perceive as an expert that they're wrong and that they know better than the expert. Like that's like a whole genre of comment and I've just learned to be like, okay, this is all about you.
I see it play out so much, especially within the neurodivergent community, where you'll have, I think Ought Teach is the profile name, but one of my mutual friends just, like she's getting her PhD in this. Like, it's like, this is not just a random whim thought situation happening. I have a lot of training and understanding in this. Plus, I am also somebody who that this is a part of my identity story. So when you are saying, no, you're right, because I feel this way, our opinions are not weighted equally. They might feel that way to you, but there are actually disciplines and frameworks that deserve or like cultivate an expertise. And so there's going to be a mismatch there. And then I see it also. There's a creator that I follow who I just love named Stephanie Buttermore. And she is a doctor she's a scientist in cellular biology, right? So, like, doctor, boom, boom. But her passion and interest has been in fitness. And then she went through this really intense all in journey to try to heal her body and her hormones after going through a lot of this rigorous dieting stuff. So, exactly to this point that you were talking about, where she is an expert over here, but she's sharing her lived experience over here. And so there's this automatic conflation that happens with a lot of people where they're assuming she has all the right answers. And so she had to, like, she just came back, but she had to disappear for many months from content creation to really go through her own experience and really try to figure out what that is for her, because she knew that as soon as she came out and presented it, for a lot of people, it was going to be held as gospel. And they would be comparing their own relationships and their own journeys to hers when, she's like, yeah, I'm an expert over here, but I'm just like a human trying to find my way through this maze that is life. Yeah. And I feel like that's a pressure that a lot of people are scared of.
I get a lot of people who can't tell when I'm being serious. On the other hand, I'm also a very goofy, chaotic person who loves to like sow chaos in the world. I love being a very like actively, blatantly saying things that like thwart the straight agenda, basically, but are done in a way that's very sassy and comical. But I kind of deliver it the same way as I would my like, this is the things I know. And that's probably on me a little bit. But also, for me, I'm like, the content is so obviously like, this is so ridiculous. It's fun that I'm saying it in this way that sounds almost like I'm like authority on this absolutely ridiculous thing that I just said. But I get people are always like, I can't tell the difference. Is this chaotic Matti or educator Matti? And I'm like, dang it, like.
I mean, I'm telling you, I don't think they're teaching ironic markers in your generation. Like, you got it maybe, and that's great. But I have a lot of conversations about intergenerational sort of things and like the way we communicate, blah, blah, blah. And my former partner, current best friend, is solidly Gen X. And because, I mean, of course, these are sweeping generalizations. This is not everybody's story. But as a generation, generally, their feelings were so invalidated that the main mechanism for expression was sarcasm. So sarcasm and irony are like the main communication tools. I, in being steeped in a lot of that stuff, and also half of my family comes from Indianan sarcasm, which is like a whole deadpan whole situation where a lot of people don't get it because you're not doing the wink, wink, whatever. And every generation has so many like fabulous things. And like, there are so many wonderful things about Gen Z that I'm like, thank you for bringing this to the table because we didn't even know that we could do this or show up this way. Also, like when it comes to certain things like irony or sarcasm, what I've noticed is and not just me, like a lot of people have talked about this, is that there is a trend toward earnest communication versus sarcasm and irony. And nothing's better or worse. They're just different strategies that we employ to communicate. But yeah, it's fascinating because I'm a deeply sarcastic person. And I find myself really using tonal inflection and all of this stuff to like really, and even sometimes I'll add a caption like, right? Like, I'm not me. Okay.
Yeah, I always use I've learned those tone indicator things, and I always put the /HJ, which is half joking, on almost everything. And I just love it because in my head, HJ is like hand job, and I'm just like LOL. Like it's like another way of like LOL for me. Like this is some good gay humor, but also it's like effective in helping people be like, oh, we're kind of joking here. I'm making a point, but we're kind of joking. New England millennials, I think, are very sarcastic. Like Northeast United States, up in the Northeast, millennials are definitely a very deeply sarcastic bunch. But I teach like an LGBTQ QIA plus and allies teen arts and creativity club with my local Parks and Rec, which is very cute.
Oh.
But those are some like solidly Gen Z kids who are all in middle school. And whenever I say anything sarcastic, they look at me like they're like, what are you saying? Why would you say it like that? I hate sarcasm. I've had them say this to me. I hate sarcasm. And I'm just like, I'm really sorry about that because that's half the things I say is really sarcastic.
They're like, you're over here slaughtering our sacred cow and we are all vegan. Stop it, please. And it's just like, oh, I love you. I forgot that you're a millennial too, because I'm actually an elder millennial. And so in my mind, I forget how far the generation goes before you drop into the newer young folks in there. Yeah, but the sarcasm is it just feels so right. But I guess if it does, and if it doesn't, it doesn't.
I also love when you were talking about generations, you did the exact caveat thing that I had mentioned a moment ago. You're like, well, I know this is not everyone's experience. Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Like but we have to do that because the internet, when it comes to generations, I remember there was one person was saying, it's like, well, it's based on if you had this. And so it's not really about the exact time period. It's about like, if you had a flip phone in high school, you're definitely blank sort of thing. Like, or if it was for Gen Z, it was like, if you had an iPhone or not, then you're Gen Z versus millennial. And that starts implicating like location, like rural versus urban and class. And so I think two people can exist at the exact same time next to each other and are in different generations because they're having such different experiences. And I think that's wild. There's probably people, I'm like smacked up, 92, like I am in the middle of the millennials, like, but I'm sure there are people I went to high school with, given their circumstances, were having, like, I feel like very, like, I was like cutting edge millennial time. I like had a BlackBerry. I was like obsessed with tech and all that, I was very online even early on. It was just like, that's where I seek it out. But I'm sure there are a lot of people who are having, even though they're my exact same age, having more an elder millennial experience because of their like circumstances, be it financial or things that they choose or don't choose, reluctance to take on new ideas.
I remember dial up and chat rooms, right? That was like very much a part of like
Yes.
the cool situation. There might be people who are far younger than me, but had some of those same experiences because their situation wasn't that of the next in tech early adopter vibes.
There's also like the teens who are like, you were on your chat rooms, and there were probably the kids who were like 9 and 8 and 10 who weren't supposed to be in there but found their way in and like accessed everything way before they were supposed to. I think that's like another thing too.
Have you seen oh my gosh, what is the name show? Pen 15?
No, but I've been meaning to watch it.
I'm late to it, but it's on Hulu and it's about these two seventh grade girls. The actors are my age playing seventh graders. And so imagine like a classroom where all the other actors are age appropriate. And then you have these two grown-ups dressed as and acting as seventh graders. It is just so good. It's so funny. It talks about so many things from like periods to masturbation to first kisses to fashion and getting too old to play with toys or, all of this kind of like awkward stuff that you go through in middle school. But what I love is that experience was exactly like they are my age. And so seeing the little things like the little butterfly clip hairdos that we used to do and think just thought were like so cool. Like I'm just going to put all these 20 micro clips in my hair and the thin eyebrows and just all of it just makes me laugh watching everything so much. It's so fascinating this is like a whole nother brain fuck, but like to watch a show that is accurate to your experience and also to know that it's a period piece is a moment, is a feeling.
Have you seen Sex Education on Netflix?
I haven't.
So that one is interesting because it's like at a high school. It feels like it's supposed to be set now. It's supposed to be obviously like set now with like current teenagers. It's like in this town in England.
Mm-hmm.
But everything about it is so clearly millennial. Like you can tell the writers are all millennials, and all the content aesthetically, it looks sort of like how Gen Zers are operating. So it looks like a Gen Z show, but all of the topics are exactly what millennials were talking about when we were in high school. And it's so fascinating to look at, and you're like, this is a utopic, or like trying to get at the issues that we were dealing with, and it has nothing to do with what Gen Z is actually dealing with.
Uh-huh.
It's people like unpacking their own experience with, but it looks like today, and you're like, wait, this is like, who is this for?
Oh my gosh, yeah, I'll have to dig into it. Because it's so, I mean, there's something so healing, I think, about having a level of abstraction to investigate your own stuff and be able to like work through your thoughts with characters. It took me a long time to really deeply appreciate that because, you're always told, like, as a person, to like, TV is not good for you, or, all of these things. So it took me a while, and, being in grad school, I think ultimately to start to really understand the relationship to media and the benefits of it and all of these things. But for me, I found that it's like so much more of a safe space to investigate some of these phenomena than looking in my own past, which can be a little murky.
Yeah, absolutely. I do not think, I was in therapy the other day, and my therapist is like begging me, like, let's talk about, I was like, I don't talk about my childhood in high school. No, just like, nope. I'm not at that point yet. We've been like, just no, like a hard, just like, no, which is such a fascinating response, because like, you're right. These shows are a phenomenal way to think about them. Like, it's great that there's like a show that like looks like it's not my experience, but it's completely exactly about my experience that I can like process through like an abstract lens. It is really interesting.
How did your therapist take it? Was it like, okay, I honor that boundary, or was it a little bit of like instigating and pushing to try to get you to go there?
Oh, no. They're amazing. They're like, oh yeah, oh, I see you're emotional. Do you want to do that? Nope. Okay. And let's talk about something else. And it
Let's
was
wrap
fine
it
because I
up.
had other things to talk about. But like, I like my therapist. They're also like my exact age and non-binary. And I've never had a therapist who is like my age. And it's a very different experience than, coming to people who are boomers or older, who are like this authority. They've seen everything and also have no clue about what my life is like, because they have no reference point to like a young non-binary trans person, young comparatively.
I love that
It's
you even have to
fascinating.
say that. You are young.
I'm about to be 30. I feel like I've been waiting to be 30 since that movie 13 Going on 30?
Yeah.
Me. Like literally, like I've been ready to be like in my 30s since I was forever. So I'm like 29 and I'm like tapping my foot. And then I look at my friends who are like 25 and I'm like, oh no, you're young. And then I
No.
look at like some of the people, my mutuals on TikTok, and they're like 19 and I'm like, oh no, you're young. Like, whew, it's a spectrum.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who is 38, I can tell you that 29 has a solid degree of youth to it. Going back to social media and things like that, where I'm starting to get the videos where people are like, tell me what it's like to be 30. And then there are people who stitch it who are like, ugh, ugh, like talking about creaking and all this stuff. And I'm like, hold up, what? No, thank you. What are you talking about? We're not, no. And then and having my own sort of relationship to rounding the quarter to 40 is bananas. And what's interesting to me, and my mom always said this, which of course, when your mom says stuff, you're like kind of roll your eyes, and then later you realize it's like wisdom, that everybody has like sort of an inherent age or age range that just like really feels like them. And as you're growing into it, you feel like, I know when I get there, like I'm just gonna, but then when you leave it, you're just like, whoa, but it was back there. And similar to you, mine was like, I would say like 32, somewhere around there, was really like, yeah, this is like where I was always called an old soul, like all of that kind of stuff.
Always.
Yes. And so when I got to that place, I was like, yep, this is it. This is it. But then when you start growing out of it, you're like, well, we're the same age, right? And then, and then somebody is like, well, how old are you? Like, oh, I guess we're not the same age. Cool.
No, so true. It's all really relative though. And maturity and the number of years you've gone around the sun, like the number of times you've gone around the sun, are not one and the same. And we try to create, once again, these large patterns of like And we create really important like legal barriers around these concepts as well. But it doesn't match up. And that's so wild.
I was going to ask you about media that's happening right now in the zeitgeist and your take on it, because I saw one of your TikToks recently where you were promising to get into Euphoria, and I don't think you actually did.
I have not delivered yet.
You being somebody who not only experientially, but also in terms of your education is so steeped in gender theory and media literacy. What is that? What is that experience? What are you noticing about some of the like hot stuff that's coming up? And namely, I was thinking about Euphoria because it's such a, it's a lot.
I need to deliver. I feel like this is like I'm taking like a week or two to like reset my socials right now, but when I'm back, I'm delivering. So anyways, here's a teaser of some of my thoughts, I guess, depending on when this is happening in time. So Euphoria, my first thoughts are, wow, I am so tricked into not recognizing that these are fully adults. And then suddenly it clicks and I'm like, these are people in their mid-20s playing. And I forget that this is not what actual teenagers look like.
Mm.
I am fully immersed sometimes because they do such an I mean, that's cinema, right? And you forget that people don't look like that when they're in their teens.
Right.
No one looks like a perfect 25-year-old. I tried watching Euphoria the first time it came out. I just binged all of it with the second season. And the first reason why I couldn't get into it, because I grew up with Skins, which is this British teen drama show that was very sophisticated and dealt with very similar things like drug addiction and like sex and consent and all these really important things. But the actors were actually the correct age. And they had a writing team that was also the right age. So, and I
Oh,
was the exact same age. And so it just was me. Whereas this one is so not that. It's like, it's very produced by adults for an adult audience about young people, but also young people are watching it and being influenced by it. And it's really fascinating. So some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of like the analysis of like gender and all of this is I'm actually really, really fascinated by the relationship of masculinity and men on the show, because the show's really not about all the men in it. There are men and they're like villainous. It's really a show like that's very like women and non-binary people, like men are bad. Which like I think like if you look at a really, really just surface level, that's like kind of what's going on with it. People need that. It's cathartic. Like
mm-hmm.
and then I'm like watching it, and that one episode with Cal, and Cal is like does like some things that are like really like not okay. A lot of things that are really not okay. Like filming people without consent, not okay. Like that is not okay. You know, breaking the age of consent within our current like culture, it's like absolutely not acceptable given the like the frameworks. And the show plays on that where for instance Nate is always hard like holding over Jules' head. You've sent me sexy selfies, you have to do whatever I say and want because you've made child porn. And this age of consent that's meant to protect people is being leveraged as a weapon versus it being a line to protect people. Like it's not actually protecting Jules. It also really harkens, I mean, I think about the fact when I was like a teen and like 16 and 17, like lying on all my dating apps saying I'm 22 and like having hookups with these dads just like what Jules did. I was like, oh, that's my story. And the whole thing is like, it's just so fascinating. But I'm thinking about that episode where we flash back to Cal's teenhood, where he's got this like friend, and clearly the two of them both like are like obviously in love with each other, but like his dad is like, I know compulsory heterosexuality. A lot of people are really mad that it's not only a lesbian term anymore, but I think that you can see that's what's happening. There's this, he's being policed. Like there's that moment his dad comes in, they're like talking about their girlfriends with him and his best friend, and like his dad's like, dinner time, get up. And he like won't stand up because that's because he has like an erection. The way that this is all policed, his girlfriend that he has to have because he's not allowed to be with his best friend, who he's also like very sexually attracted to, gets pregnant because this is the thing that you have to do. And then he gets roped into this whole life and like circumstantially becomes this person who is easy to despise because he's doing things that are not okay. And then just thinking, I mean, for me as like a trans person who feels very much like I was able to escape all of that by transitioning in a really real way, I feel so sad that this is like experience that a lot of men have to go through. They become the monsters they're foretold to be. Like there's this notion in our world that because of the way assigned male bodies are, that men are these inherent like sex monsters who are going to like go after everyone. It's this a really common notion in our societies. A lot of societies frame protecting women based on this idea that men are inherently biologically like sex monsters, basically. But really, what's also happening at the same time is we're creating a society where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and people have no other option but to become it because there are no channels of actual dealing with like what is your sexuality, how do you express that. On one hand, I'm like, wow, sucks, this person has turned out so terrible, and it's so sad because it didn't have to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think about how many men are out there who are like shitty toxic dudes, and I just mourn the people they could have been if we didn't have the system that confined them and forced them to do that and rewarded them and punished them if they didn't conform. Gives them so much power and reward for being exactly this terrible thing that they're purported to be. But it's like a social habit, and it's not. I can't believe that because you have a penis, you're like an inherently like sexually evil creature that needs to be like stopped, and we need to police girls' bodies and what they're wearing so that like people aren't being distracted. It's like, that's a behavior. We have to teach people to like not always just like act on all of their instincts and hormones or whatever. It's not like that's not a thing, but it's so covered up by all these structures and systems that are trying to get at what is and is not natural. And a lot of queer theory is about unpacking what's considered normal or what the rhetorics of the natural are covering up about what's actually constructed and social. What we call natural often isn't something that exists outside in nature. It's just something that we're calling natural. That's just something that I think about with this show is, and then like the generational trauma of it all, where I'm curious, what was Nate's grandpa, Cal's dad, what turned him into this person who wants to police sexuality and gender roles? What experiences did he have that caused this Nate to become this actually aggressive, terrible, scary monster that is like actively leveraging his privilege in a way that's actually like removing agency from other people in a way that's physically violent and almost murderous in several cases?
What is really interesting and nuanced about what you're bringing up, which I really appreciate, is that there's often this conflation between empathy and accountability for a lot of us because it's really a complicated thing to deal with emotionally. And it's much easier to just say, this is a bad human, goodbye. It can be difficult to really look at the full scope of a situation. And when you were talking, I was thinking, of course, there's a parallel. Of course, things are different, but we can look at commonalities in the way that Black men have been treated, the fear that is cultivated and the way their bodies are policed. And you can look at a group of men from a certain background in a certain situation and say, oh, those are really violent, horrible dudes. And it's like, yes. And if you plucked them out of that context and had them grow up and live a life in this other beautiful, fertile soil, inevitably the result would be different. And I'm very lucky in that I was raised with a mom that constantly was on me about empathy and trying to understand where people are coming from and really trying it to best of my ability, put myself in the why. And some people don't think and I understand, don't think it's valuable to ask those questions because they think that it's then giving some form of, I think there's a difference between acceptance and saying that something is okay. Like there's a difference between accepting that this happened and accepting that this person needs to take accountability, and also really seeing the huge context that things exist within and having empathy for the human that finds themselves in these circumstances. And for me, the way that I can really talk about it from my own lived experience is that when I was, and this is a content warning because of violence mentioned, is that when I was 19, my cousin, we were very much raised as siblings. She was unalived in a very brutal way by her then boyfriend that she was trying to break up with, who also happened to be a friend of mine. And I had to deal with the complexity of emotions of having love and empathy toward this person, really not at all accepting the ramifications of what happened or the action that this person did, and really having to sit in both of those. Because for me, I understand, but there were a lot of people that I interfaced with, even some people in my family that were like, I hope he rots in prison. I hope really vile, horrible things happen to him because he deserves that. Whilst I understood that, I also understood that there is no way that you can perpetrate that type of horrific act on another human being without some context of trauma and like all of this other stuff, whether it's structural differences in the brain, whether it's things that you've lived through and circumstances, whatever. Like there's just no way that you can go from like this cute little tiny ball of love and then go into a human who's doing this thing. Like there has to be some journey in there. In trying to honor that and hold space for that, I mean, to me, I found it very relieving because I could forgive like the soul of that human, right? Like the soul, the baby, the potential, like you said, the potential of who that person could have been. I can hold a lot of love and forgiveness for that. I can also really hate the action and hate what transpired and also be grateful for some of the ramifications of that. Not that I ever would have wished that, but even at the time, I knew it was a gift that our whole family came together for 2 weeks and almost like lived together. And my cousin flew in from Germany and another cousin came who ended up dying a year later. And so we had all of these very strong, loving, amazing memories with him because of these circumstances. Going back to Euphoria, this is a very long loop, but going back to Euphoria, I think there's something so transformational. And also, I understand why people have such deep resistance to experiencing it when you have somebody who's acting as a villain. And also, we see the context for how they got there. And it creates dissonance. But I think that dissonance is so powerful.
It's always a bigger picture. Last year, I remember when the wildfires, remember there were those wildfires and it was a gender reveal party that had set it off?
Yeah.
That couple went to jail and everyone was celebrating. I remember making Instagram stories saying like, I'm not celebrating this. I don't ever want to see anyone like go to the prison given the current system that we're in. Why are we celebrating this? It's a terrible circumstance, but also why aren't we pointing to the large scale global climate change effects that have made this forest so flammable? Why are we not looking at like the precautions that are made to make sure people aren't in these spaces because they were where they're not supposed to be, right? And it's all this onus is put on this couple as if they're the ones who caused everything. And it's so easy to find like the person to blame and punish. People like need the scapegoat, right? But do they need it? I don't know. But I just remember people were like cheering and celebrating and be like, finally, like justice. I remember being like, I'm not happy about this. I'm sad that people are now put in prison for something that, yes, they did something stupid. Yes, I also hate gender reveal parties. They were idiots. And also the idea that they are responsible for someone's house burning down 1,000 miles away is ludicrous in my brain, but people connect them.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think that's a little bit different because there are many more steps in between than someone actively killing someone they really know. Different, but maybe people need different scales to help them get to the middle.
To me, like the grief and the whole concept of gender reveal performance escalation. It's not like when I was growing up where it was like a little like, hey, just so you know, like a text message, whatever, which still not cool. We don't need it. But like from that to like, we need balloons and we need fireworks and we need, like just the fact that the growing emphasis being placed on this ritual that is inherently taking agency away from that being.
But for people, because they're angry about this ritual and they found one example of someone who did something that caused something huge, it's like this thing to like, finally, we got him. I don't know. I just like didn't feel the same way as everyone else. I didn't know how to articulate it. And I remember I actually had friends reach out and were like, this is so bad. People died from that fire. And I was like, it's so huge. This is so big. Remember, I lost friends because people were like, how could you ever think this way? They need to be punished. People died. It's a huge domino pile that they are the idiots who happen to bump into it, doing something that you hate. But who set up the domino pile?
Yes. And like, who benefits from the I never say that right, Schadenfreude, which is like
Oh yeah.
that emotion of enjoying somebody else's suffering or feeling like they got what they deserve. Like nobody benefits. Like if you really feel into what that feels like in your body, to me, it's the emotional equivalent of a whippet. Yeah, it might make you feel a tiny bit better about yourself for like 0.2 seconds. But then after you realize that your brain cells have died, you are feeling hungover and maybe a line of Coke, actually, because that lasts longer. But you feel the effects afterwards, which is why I haven't done it in over a decade. It doesn't feel good and it's not the highest expression of yourself. And also, what's fascinating to me about this, and this is what I refer to as like the mixed kid superpower. And my definition of mixed is anybody who is through circumstance, through identity, through life experience, has had to spend a lot of time straddling worlds. For me, it's like I literally raised between the East Coast and the West Coast. I am mixed culturally and racially. Like there are just so many ways. But I think that you can arrive at this mixedness from so many different ways. But what it does is it cracks you open to that, yes, and also this. Yes, and also this. And I am so activated when somebody's like, but of course you need to think this way. It is only this way. Like you must be this way. Because I'm like, it never is. Never. That means that you are not seeing this third door over here if you're only looking at this and that. And guess what? My life is lived in the third door. So, bitch, you don't know me. I have always felt very held and supported, and why I think there's so many beautiful ramifications of finding people who are just like living in a similar space, even though that might look differently. There is this really beautiful resonance of being able to house dualities that is just so beautiful, and why I have always really resonated with people who are non-binary and trans, because I mean, not always. So it's a huge generalization, right? But oftentimes, in order to arrive there, you have to confront the duality and have to understand that there's a third option, there's a multiplicity of options, and that sort of expansion means we have this resonance that not everybody has.
I liked your definition because I'm also like very like mixed class and mixed up with my genders, and there are many connections of people who are able to see the world differently. I mean, it feels like I know liminal is one of those words that get thrown around a lot, but like it is like this liminal spaces, right? I think there are empathies, and also I think it's also important at the same time to recognize that these large scale social structures are distinct projects that function so differently. And so you find entry points on how to be empathetic. I feel very much this resonance of like, I get this in between mixed thing. I can see many things. But still, when it comes to like systemic racism, for instance, where I don't necessarily experience it as an oppressed person, I still live in a world where that's happening. I've got I've got moments where I can't see it, or the people who I know I'm training who are cis who want to get things and have had an experience of gender that is constricting and like awful, but they're still like a cisgender person, and they might have blind spots, but it's this whole systems that are affecting all of us. And so I have a lot of empathy for my people I'm teaching when I am teaching
Yeah.
about gender, just because it's this thing that gets at all of us. And I'm so glad that I've landed in a spot where I can see the third options, or the fifth and the sixth and the 20th and the infinity
Yeah.
options. And I love being able to share that because I know the pain that can be from these constrictions, and people don't even know where the constricting is coming from sometimes. And it has really big material realities, and some people don't even ever have the opportunity to investigate it because they can't afford it, or they're too scared to take out student loans because what if you can't pay them back? And which I'm like, oh my God, what if I can't pay these back? Like,
I mean, I have yet to do that.
I think one thing that could bring us back to the beginning here is back to Shannon Sullivan, this theory on habits, and it's American pragmatism. There's a whole chapter on feminist standpoint theory, which is this idea that if we want to look at gender, feminists have the closest to objective perspective on gender because they are like the most oppressed by it. And then Shannon Sullivan's like, yes, and also all those people have been raised in the exact same system, and so we can't inherently only trust people's lived experience as the objective, real truth because they're also in the system. They have been taught the system. Their perspective is shaped by it. And it actually requires a multiplicity of perspectives from people in all contexts to come and look at the same thing we're trying to get at. There is no one perspective that has all the answers. And I think a lot of people are looking for that one person. I think a lot of people are like, I need to find the lesbian, queer, Black, trans woman to answer all of my problems and tell me the real truth. That person doesn't exist because there's no one who has all the answers.
A couple weeks ago, there was this video circulating. It was a clip from the Man Enough podcast, and the guest, Liz Plank, was asked by one of the hosts, like, what gives you the right to be an authority or speak on masculinity? And she said, the same thing that gives you an authority makes you the best person to speak about whiteness. And, this is a Black man, right? Like, when you are oppressed by that, you know everything about the oppressor. And I can see things, blah, blah, blah. I think that video resonated so much. Also, I think that what you're saying also bears mindfulness, right? That like Liz Plank's perspective could and should also be met with a perspective from like where you're coming from and this person over here. And I think this guruifying is dangerous because we all just, going back to what you were talking about, where people are kind of, doing that to you, where they're like, just tell me, can I identify this way? Where it's this quick, easy fix that you just want the immediacy of the relief to know what's right and wrong, to know where you belong. And in that, you give your power away to other individuals without really being able to hold space for the complexity of everything. And like for the example of toxic masculinity, to your point, like there isn't any one person that can be the authority on that because we are all going to have blind spots. But I think that can be very tough for people to sit with.
It's tough. And also, I think this reaction to find the perspective that is from the oppressed perspective is in response to centuries of this oppression and the people who are experiencing oppression being silenced and their stories not being told at all, right? It's not coming from like a malicious perspective to be like, I know better and you don't. Like it's coming from well, I've been silenced. I want to share my story too. But it gets also framed as your personal experience of the system of oppression because you are in that position, you're an authority all of a sudden, which you are of your experience.
And also, I would say that you are really good at pattern recognition. Like I liken it to the whole framework around trauma, right? If you grew up in a household that was inherently destabilized, you developed a hypervigilance because that's what you needed to survive. So you're going to notice and like almost develop a superpower of sensing where people are at or whatever to keep yourself safe. And so when we think about this with oppressed groups, like I think that's where this idea of code switching and all of this stuff comes into play, because a lot of times these are very tenuous, very scary dynamics. Like there's the whole phenomenon of sundown towns, where if you don't know that like this is a place that because of your identity, you need to be out of by a certain time. And if you're not, this is how you need to change the way you speak or change the way you dress or whatever. There is this hyper awareness and knowledge about the oppressor or the oppressive mechanism that is cultivated because there's the threat of violence.
Yeah, I think that there is a perspective there. It's a perspective that's been erased actively in our societal rhetorics, and we need to bring it in. We can also hold at the same time the truth that it's not the only perspective or the most objective, but it's like so important. And we're putting currently at this time period, we're putting so much emphasis on these because they have been silenced for so long and they need to be said.
But we might be overshooting it.
We're always overcorrecting. We learn a new concept and we overcorrect.
Yeah.
There might be a certain level of overcorrection of personal experience creating authority, but not in a bad way. It's responding to something. It was necessary. And I think that we might have overshot it in having studied these large scale systems of like race and gender and sex. the people who have spent like their entire lives analyzing it speak on it in a very different way than the individual person who has experienced depression and are using the rhetoric that they get and are parroting certain phrases because they're useful phrases. I don't want to disparage using words that you know and have learned. That's not the goal here. When you're speaking only from the I, it's hard to remember that there are many I's who all have so many experiences. It'd be so easy for me to be like, I have the trans experience. I know everything about all trans people. It's really easy as like an online creator to be like, I know everything because I'm trans. Listen to me. Also, it would be very tempting to be like, I've studied everything about trans people. I know all of it. And I think people who delve into that from either perspective, I'm wary because I think there's that, what's that one, another one of those, we were talking about those platitudes. One of those platitudes that has really come into meaning something to me is the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know anything. And I'm like, oh my goodness, the things I don't know. And the fact that everyone thinks I'm an expert when I'm realizing how much I don't know at the same time as everyone thinking I know everything. That's a hard spot to be in. I don't know.
Keeps me up at night. That phenomenon that you're talking about, there's a theory for that phenomenon. I'm sure it happened to me a lot before grad school, but then in going to grad school where we were just so steeped in art theory, you realize that, you hear people talking about things and you're like, oh, yeah, there's a theory for that. It's called blah, blah, blah. I find it very delighting. And I also know that I'm always going to be that person on the on that other end of the stick because
Yes.
I was only able to study one thing. I'm inevitably going to be at some dinner party where I'm like, this idea just occurred to me. What if da 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 da? And then, somebody be like, there's a theory for that. It's you know.
But I love when I'm told there's a theory for that because I'm like, great, I get to go learn some more theory. But I'm also like a theory addict, though. I'm like, I miss reading fiction. The only thing I can read is theory now, which is such a sad reality. But also, I love it. I'm like, it's so good.
Well, yeah, also a gift. See, I pump and dumped a lot of stuff because I just needed to survive. And a lot of it, it's not that it didn't resonate. It was that now this is like 2011. So just the ratio of who you would read and what was presented was very skewed toward the canon identity, right? So it's like, how many of these white guys can we read about from, the 1800s? Who cares? Blah. They all had drinking problems. Like, I'm over it. But every once in a while, like something will pop up. And then it's like, oh, yeah, that does, one of the like key texts that I used for my thesis was this book by amazing sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva that is called Racism Without Racists. He talks about the rhetorical strategies that uphold racism at the same time as people are asserting that they're not racist. Every once in a while, there would be something that just like was just so resonant and stuck so much. I literally have a file cabinet of all of my readings that I say I'm someday going to come back to. And maybe when I've healed enough of the emotional stuff left over from that program, which I'm also very grateful for, I will, but not today.
Racism Without Racists is a phenomenal read for anyone out there. In my like critical race studies course, we read some of that, and it's an iconic text. Go read it, folks, for real.
Yes.
A video of mine that went like a little viral, not really, like low key, was I was like, I don't really super trust when people use male and man synonymously or female woman synonymously. For me, it's one of those clear cut examples of you see assigned sex as very important and the derivative thing of like where someone's sense of self comes in this large scale social structures that we are navigating. And it's just like a telltale sign that you've not thought about your relationship to how you see bodies if you're just flipping between them super fast. It's just a rhetorical thing that like is telling. But it's not like that they're like actively transphobic or hateful or I mean they might be. Probably a lot of them are. It's possible. But also it's more that it's a telltale that like this rhetoric that you use that's upholding a system. And once again, all of the different fields of theory, they have turns at the same time. I studied like a historical methodologies class in grad school where basically all of the social sciences were all obsessed with the same thing parallel to each other and they kind of influence each other, but they didn't really know they were doing the same thing. And that happens over and over and over again. I think today we think of intersectionality as this just given. It's just like a given. We study all the intersections of identities, like duh. And I think it's really important to remember that as like an academic tradition across all modalities is about maybe maximum 10 years old, maximum, but probably more like 5 to 6 years old. of really integrating this as like a tenet of all social sciences across the board. Like intersectionality as an idea came about through the Combahee River Collective in the like 80s and Kimberly Crenshaw in the 70s and Kimberly Crenshaw. And it finally worked its way into feminist, like mainstream, not mainstream, but like feminism, like as like sort of like an academic tradition by like the late 90s, 2000s. And then it took until like 2010 for it to come online and then people talk about it. And then now it's like back in your program. How could it? It's like it also wasn't a thing that people knew about yet, even though it's like so obvious to us now.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that was the thing. Like, I remember that's where I was first introduced to it because the chair of our program was just phenomenal. Also, this is like pre-Trump. I was having conversations trying to advocate for why we should even be having conversations around identity, because the prevailing thought was that we were post racism and we were post all of these things. And I was just like, I know you might feel that, my love, but like, that's not la situación. So like, can we?
Not the case.
And so half of my energy, which is like the classic minority life lot that hopefully we grow out of, is that like a certain portion of our energy has to go to creating space, managing, like just even creating a container that we can exist within with our wants and needs and expression and all of these things. It's interesting because post-Trump, it's like all of that energy is gone. Like everybody's like, oh yeah, we need to be talking about these things. And so it's like, oh, it would have, like, I wonder what it would have felt like if it was just a given that everybody understood, instead of so much of my defense, so much of my critique, so much of that had to go to why we should even be having the conversation, which is just wild now in hindsight to even think about. So, okay, are you ready for the G speed?
Okay.
What is a failure that turned out to be a gift?
When I was teaching English as a second language, I was trying to do like a gender class, like for a bunch of like very proficient, very rich kids in English. So like they really like were able to have conversations in English about difficult topics, but they were all very rich conservative kids. And I tried to have like a gender conversation class with them. Because some of the girls from like Venezuela were like, we want this, there's femicide, we need to talk about gender. And then like these boys from Saudi Arabia like were like not having it.
Mm-hmm.
And also like some like very conservative, rich French boys. Anyways, on the first day of that week, because we did like weekly themes, we were having conversations and I let myself slip and be like, I'm so glad you boys are uncomfortable. And it was this massive failure because they walked out of the room. They like told on me to like the person who's in charge of the school that I was like making them uncomfortable as like this gay person who is pushing the agenda and all that stuff. It ended up being like a tool that now I know if I actually want people to get the message, I need to be more sneaky and more make people comfortable, not in real life, but as a tool, as an educator.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people are like, you need to be uncomfortable. I'm like, people do not learn when they're uncomfortable. And I need to.
I'm going to send you my grammatically riddled thesis. That's 100% what it was about. Generational strategies versus tactics used by people to have conversations and the different ways we would get viewers to enter into conversations and how there isn't a mutual understanding of the differences based on the context. It is filled with, even though I had a copy editor, it's filled with grammatical errors and like typos.
As someone who has a bachelor's in linguistics and has taught English grammar for like half a decade, that's fake. If you wrote it, you speak English, it's perfectly fine grammar. I am going to fight you on that. Like, it's perfect. I haven't read it. But if you wrote it and you're an English speaker and it's in English, you did a great job.
I love that. Yay. Yeah, it's called, yeah, right. And the emperor is fully clothed. So I feel like we'll resonate about it.
Oh, I love that title.
So who was your first celebrity crush?
I'm like so blanking. I'm just going to say Milo from Atlantis, but also those two boys and also everyone from Road to El Dorado. A lot of cartoons. I watched a lot of cartoons. Terminator, everyone in Terminator. Ripley and Alien.
Yeah, solid.
But also that's like, is she like someone who I want to be or someone I want to be? It's very that. I'm like, am I want to be with Ripley or do I want to be be with or am I? Anyways, Ripley,
I mean,
oh my God.
As a lesbian who is constantly in this conversation, I can tell you it's one that I do not still to this day have sorted out because I'm sensing this really intense attraction. And I don't know if it's because I just want to put you on or we connect this way because, yeah.
Grace Jones, one of my favorite quotes by Grace Jones is this interview when like she's being asked if she's attracted to women. Some like 80s guy trying to goad her into being you're obviously gay because you look like the way you look, Grace Jones,
Yeah.
duh. And she's just like, how could I not be? I want to find myself attractive. And so I am a woman and I find women attractive because I think I'm an attractive person. It like actually kind of came back around to be a very gay sort of thing because I think a lot of queer people do have that like it's a seeing of yourself in a certain way. Like it's an attraction to yourself when you're doing
Mhm.
that because you are partially that person.
That is the most complex answer to that question, which makes me so happy. Okay, tell me about an object that just brings you the most delight.
Yes, there is a little like brass fox that my mom got as a gift for like the work she was doing with some I don't remember exactly how she got it, but when I like went to college, I was obsessed with this little tiny it's like a sand fox with like the big ears. And I totally like took this little tiny metal figure and I'm so sorry, mom, I stole this. I like was obsessed with it. I know that you were like, it's mine, and then I took it anyways, but I'm still fully obsessed with it. My mom knows I've got it. It's all good now, but still I'm like, it's so cute. And I don't know, I'm just so obsessed with it. Like little tiny gold brass objects is my favorite genre of object. I have a whole cabinet of curiosities. Like my old ass Somerville, Massachusetts apartment has like a little built-in like glass cabinet, and I filled it with like weird trinkets.
Oh my
And there's like a
gosh.
whole shelf of only like weird little tiny brass objects, and this fox is amongst them.
Okay, if you could wave a magic wand, distill one concept to the whole of humanity, what would it be?
I would want them to understand the huge breadth and spectrum of human bodies and to also learn that biological essentialism is bullshit. And that's sort of like that people could just see bodies and people who are like driving slash are the body as not just their bodies, but also there are so many different kinds and shapes and we can't actually categorize them. And then we can't say what people are and are not based on these bad categories. That's what I would do.
I 100% approve of that. And Loki, I wish that that could be a thing. But my very gay mother capacity is dwindling today. So no wandage for you. Okay, penultimate question. What is a question nobody asks you?
Not enough people ask me about my D&D characters. I play so much Dungeons and Dragons every week. I DM like a campaign. I DM multiple campaigns. I play in multiple campaigns. I spend half a day's worth every week, almost some days on like maximum. And like no one asks me about my D&D characters or what's happening in my D&D worlds, and that's crying shame because I'm really good at D&D and it's really interesting and spend way too much time doing it. And so that's something people don't ask me about is my very rich fantasy world where that I live in a lot or worlds plural because that's many games.
Uh-huh. Well, tell me like what's one D&D character that is just yeah.
Okay, right now I'm currently playing a human monk. There's different like subclasses of monks, and this one is the Way of the Dragon. They have like this big robe that is covered in eyeballs that lets them see in the dark. But also, if like there's a flash of light nearby, like they are kind of blinded low key because like they can't close their eyes. Like eyes are always open because of this cloak. They're from this like monastery where they are a bunch of scholars who study everything to do with dragons, and they are like the prodigy child who is being finally sent out because no one else is allowed to shine because they know everything about everything. And so they're like the masters, like you've learned enough. Everyone else needs to learn stuff. Leave now. Go save the world or something. Like, and so they're like joining this big war effort because basically their master, who was a secretly a dragon in disguise the entire time, because gold dragons in this world can change themselves into humanoid shapes. Basically reveals himself to be a dragon, gives him like this dragon scale that like this character needs to like use to create this like magic sword with this people that I'm like in a party with. And anyways, yeah. So I'm playing like a badass dragon monk who like is really cool and has a lot of cool magic powers and is also really good at fighting and is really smart and awesome. And I love them. Their name's Halcyon Door, like D apostrophe or like gold because it's like a gold dragon. But anyways,
That sounds fucking amazing. I wish I knew more about D&D because without context, that just sounds like so fucking fascinating and cool beyond belief. but I know so little about it. Like I literally don't even know if it's like a board game or how you keep. Yeah,
If you
yeah.
ever want to learn to play, just hit me up. I would happily teach you this very overly complicated, beautiful system
Okay.
any day.
I love it. Okay, last question. What does it mean to be bold?
I'm going to misquote Coraline because I can never remember quotes because my memory is like, "Mwah." There is a line, at least in the movie. This is Neil Gaiman's book turned into the movie by Leica Studios. If you have not seen it, Coraline is so good. But there's this line where it's that courage isn't not being afraid. Courage is being afraid and still doing it anyways. That's like my version of boldness is this courage in the face of fear and to keep going because I know I want to do it anyways. Like that's for me is like a boldness that I have to tell you, I have growing up, I had like a movie I would watch during like a summer. Like I had a summer movie and I would watch it every day. It's like there was like a summer, it was like Scott Pilgrim versus the World. There was a summer, it was that movie Sucker Punch. And then one of them was Coraline. So I had like a summer, I've seen Coraline a lot. But that idea of boldness of just like in the face of immense terror and things that are absolutely completely unconquerable, doing it anyways, even though you know it's probably not going to work out and you're just like, let's just go. And I think that's my version of boldness.
That makes me so happy to just hear that reflected because I feel like we're so in sync with that and what it looks like and that it doesn't always look like the perfect pretty picture one would want. So tell people how they can connect with you now that they're obsessed.
So you can follow me on TikTok and Instagram, and I think technically Twitter, but I like don't use Twitter. It's Mix Matisse DuPont. So I'll spell that. It's MXMATISSE Mix, if you don't know, is like the gender neutral Mr. Ms. It's Mix. So it's just like your teacher, Mix Matisse DuPont. So you can find me there. I have a website, MatisseDuPont.com. You can email me hello@MatisseDuPont.com. I feel like I just said my name so many times. Um, and I feel like those are sort of the main channels. If you ever want to get in touch, feel free to email me, DM me on socials. Those are all phenomenal ways to find me for my services, find me for my teaching, all that good stuff.
I was going to say, because you do one on one coaching and companies can hire you to do trainings and speaking, and you also do classes. That is really exciting. I actually took one of your classes last year. I don't know if you remember.
Wait, which one?
Gender is a spectrum or something like that. It was
Seeing the spectrum. That's
seeing the spectrum. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. That makes me so happy to. Okay, cool. That's awesome.
So I am one of your students. I don't know if you knew that, but yeah.
I have to take one of your classes sometime soon as well. Yeah, but I love teaching classes both online. Yeah, I come into institutions and kind of teach the basics of like trans inclusivity or how to use pronouns or just like what is gender and things like that. I do consulting work. Similarly, I've been consulting with museums a lot lately, and architecture firms actually have been like a really specific set of client. Yeah, so I'm around if you want to talk about gender in any way, shape, or form, be it personal, institutional, cultural, theoretical. I'm your person.
You're down for the get down. Love it.
I'm down.
Thank you so much for sharing your just fabulous energy and all the amazingness with us. You're a treasure.
Gia, thank you so much for having me. You're also a treasure. I feel so honored to be among all of these incredible guests that you've had on the show. And I just want to say thank you a million times over for having me and having this discussion. It's really been like the highlight of this week. I just thank you so much.
What an amazing conversation, right? Like everything about their energy. And you could tell we just had this fabulous, fabulous rapport. And I think it was the first time we had actually connected in any sort of real-time capacity, even though we've been stalking each other for at least a year now. And I just appreciate them so much. And I hope that you appreciated this conversation because I think having these conversations where we allow space to really investigate, really be curious and challenge and poke and support and affirm and just all of those things, I think is really where we're moving into culturally as a society, and certainly myself as a human, and I hope you as a human is really trying to play in the nuance of it, trying to really get in there and get cozy and be comfortable being uncomfortable and all of that good stuff. So I love you so much. I hope you have a fantastic week. I hope that it's filled with insights and hugs and just really being able to appreciate the environment that you're in. Like I've been walking around recently and doing derives, which is just an aimless walk, and really listening to birds, like the bird sounds all of a sudden. I've like really tuned into them. I'm like, oh my gosh, birds are fucking amazing. So I hope that for you, whether it's birds or something else, that it's just that ability to really tune into something that maybe you've been exposed to your whole life and sort of forgot the awe and wonder that's associated with it. And I am sending you the most love, and I will see you next week. Bye.